rain had been at it since Michaelmas, and by the time the London coach set her down at the crossroads above Hartswell Grange, the road itself had turned to a brown gruel that swallowed the wheels to the axle. She walked the last mile with her father's chain coiled across one shoulder and his ledger pressed flat against her ribs beneath her cloak, as though the wet might reach through wool and skin both to spoil the only inheritance she had left. She was 21, and she had buried her father 6 weeks before, in a churchyard in the east, riding where the frost had come early and made the digging hard. The fever had taken him in 9 days. It had taken, before that, every shilling of savings toward the physician, so that what remained to her upon his death was not money but method. The brass chain with its worn links, the cracked ledger with its close, spidered tallies, and the habit, learned at his elbow since she was old enough to hold a pencil steady, of checking a sum twice before trusting it once. The Grange announced itself before she saw it, in the smell of wet stone and a coal smoke carried down the valley on a wind that had teeth in it. Then the house itself rose from the fog, long, gray, and shuttered in 3 windows out of 5, with ivy grown thick enough over the east wing to suggest no one had troubled to cut it back in a decade. She was received at the servants' entrance by a butler with tired eyes and careful hands, who took her wet cloak without comment and left her standing in a corridor that smelled of tallow and old paper. She had time enough to notice the state of the flagstones, cracked, several of them, and mended with a poorer stone that did not match. Before a door opened at the corridor's end, and a man came through it who did not trouble to introduce himself. He was tall, dark-coated, and looked at her the way a man looks at an invoice he suspects is wrong. "You are the governess," he said. Not a question. "I am, my lord. £12 a year, and you will keep to the nursery wing unless sent for." His eyes moved once over the ledger's edge, just visible beneath her arm. "I understand your father surveyed land for a living." "He did, my lord." "A useful trade for those who own no land of their own." He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse than cruelty would have. "You will find we have little use for chains and figures here, only for a child who requires discipline and does not presently have it." He turned before she could answer, and the door closed on him with a sound like a verdict. She stood a moment longer in the cold corridor, the ledger warm still from her own body's heat, and thought, "He has not asked what my father taught me to see." The butler found her there still some minutes later, and said nothing of what he must have heard, only that he would show her to the nursery wing before the light went entirely. He carried no candle himself, but produced one from his coat, for her, already trimmed as though he had known she would need it before she did. She noted this. Her father had taught her that a man's habits told more than his words, and a butler who kept a spare candle trimmed and ready was a man used to a house where things were not provided when they ought to be. The nursery wing lay up 2 flights and along a corridor colder than the one below it, the plaster cracked in a long seam above the skirting that widened, she guessed, another eighth of an inch each winter the frost worked at it. She filed the observation away without meaning to. It was a habit now, this filing. 30 years of measurement in her father's hand had become, in her, an instinct she could not put down, even in grief, even in a strange house where she owned nothing but a ledger and a chain, and the clothes she stood in. The child was awake despite the hour, sitting cross-legged on a window-seat with her nose nearly to the glass, watching nothing that could be seen in the dark beyond it. She did not turn at the sound of the door. "You are the new one," the child said, in a voice that had already learned to sound unimpressed. "The last one cried in the linen closet and left in a hired chaise." "I don't intend to cry in the linen closet." That's what she said, too. The child turned then, and studied her the way the Lord had studied the ledger's edge, assessing, faintly suspicious, prepared to be disappointed. "Do you know sums?" "I know sums."
Uncle says sums are for men who keep the accounts, and that a girl needs only enough arithmetic to run a household and not be cheated by tradesmen. She said it the way a child repeats something heard often enough to have worn smooth, without judgment of its truth. Is that so? She thought of the corridor below, of the man's eyes moving once over the ledger's edge as though it were a curiosity beneath his notice. Your uncle is wrong about a great many things he has never troubled to examine, she said, and immediately wondered if she ought not to have said it to a child of 10. But the girl's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the ancestor of one. And she thought, there, that is the first door in this house that is open to me, rather than closed. She set the ledger on the small deal table by the bed, out of the child's reach but within her own, and did not yet know that within a fortnight she would be asked to open it in this house's service, not her own. The child's name for the room, she would learn, was the Blue Chamber, though no blue remained in it save a faded ribbon of paint above the wainscot, the rest gone to the color of weak tea. She catalogued the room the way her father had taught her to catalogue a field before he ran the chain through it, not out of habit alone, but because a place tells you what it has suffered before anyone speaks a word about it. Water stain, west corner, shaped like a country on no map. Grate swept but not blacked this month. Curtain hem let down twice, the old needle holes visible if one held the fabric to the candle. A house does not lie about neglect even when its people do. She was still cataloguing when the housekeeper came to fetch her for supper. A woman with a ring of keys at her waist and a face schooled into the particular blankness of someone who has served long enough to know which silences are safe. She led her down a back stair that smelled of tallow and damp stone, past a passage where a boot boy sat blacking a pair of riding boots, with more attention than the task warranted. Listening, she understood at once to whatever might be said above him. His lordship does not dine with the household, the housekeeper said, as though anticipating a question that had not been asked. You'll take your supper in the schoolroom with the child of an evening. It is not thought fitting otherwise. I had not thought otherwise, she said, and meant it, though she noted, because noting was now simply what she did with any fact offered to her, that the housekeeper had felt the need to say it at all, unprompted, as though the arrangement required defending before it was even challenged. The schoolroom, when they reached it, held a fire only half made up, and a table set for one small person, and now, one large intrusion upon the household's expectations. The child was already there, feet not reaching the floor, watching her enter with the frank, unblinking assessment particular to children who have been told to be wary of strangers and have not yet learned how to disguise the watching. Cook says you came with a box and a ledger, and nothing else, the child said, by way of greeting. Cook is nearly right. I came with a chain as well. She sat and did not explain further, and watched the child decide visibly not to ask what a surveyor's chain was for, though the question sat plain on her face, waiting for another evening. Below them, through the floor and the old plaster, came the faint sound of a door closing hard enough to carry, and a voice, not the words, only the register of it, low and displeased, moving through the house like weather no one had been warned of. The housekeeper's eyes went briefly to the ceiling, then away, and she thought, there is a storm kept somewhere in this house, and I have not yet learned which room it lives in. The child's name, she would learn within the hour, was spoken by the household with a particular gentleness reserved for those who have already lost too much. An orphaned niece of 10 years, placed at Hartswell Grange by an aunt's decree in a solicitor's letter, and raised since by servants who loved her more than they were paid to. She did not ask about the girl's parents. She had learned in her own year of grief that questions of that kind were better left to arrive on their own schedule. The schoolroom itself told her what the rest of the house had already implied. The globe on its stand had not been dusted in some season past. A crack ran through the Atlantic like a fault line, and when she touched it, the wood beneath the plaster gave slightly, softened by damp she suspected came from a roof.
Somewhere above them she had not yet seen. The window glass was old enough to ripple the gray light passing through it. Two candles, both stubs, sat in a dish with wax pooled and hardened into a shape like a small white hill. "We are to do sums," the child announced, with the resignation of one reciting an unwelcome fact. "And French, though Cook says French is for people with nothing better to think about." "Cook may be right about that as well," she said, and was rewarded with the ghost of a smile, quickly suppressed, as though smiling too readily at a stranger were a debt one might later regret incurring. They began with sums, simple ones, columns of small numbers she wrote out on a slate gone gray with age. And she watched the child work not for the answers, but for the manner of arriving at them. Quick, careless, impatient with the middle steps, the sort of arithmetic that trusted its own instinct over its own checking. It was, she thought, very like watching a young hound that had never been taught to quarter a field. Not unintelligent, merely unschooled in doubt. "You count twice?" the child said suddenly, watching her correct a column. "Why twice?" "Because a number believed is not the same as a number proven," she said. "And my father held that the first is worth nothing at all." The child considered this with more gravity than the subject seemed to warrant for a 10-year-old, then bent again to her slate and did, this time, count twice. Below them the house had gone quiet. The earlier weather of raised voices passed on to wherever such storms retreated between outbursts. But she found she was listening for it still, the way one listens after a clap of thunder, for the sound to come again, uncertain from what quarter it will arrive next, or upon whom it will finally break. It came, as it happened, before supper. She was summoned to the small parlor where the dowager sat with her needlework abandoned in her lap, a posture that seemed to her already a kind of verdict, for a woman who worked her needle as constantly as the dowager did, to let it lie idle was itself a form of speech. The old woman did not look up at once. She let the silence establish itself first, the way one lets a fire catch before adding the larger log. "You have a method," the dowager said at last. "The child says you count twice." "I do, madam." "And what do you make of the estate office?" The question arrived so plainly that she nearly mistook it for idle talk, the sort of thing said to fill a room before the tea grew cold. But the dowager's eyes had not moved from her, and there was nothing idle in them. "I have not seen it," she said, which was true, and which she suspected the dowager already knew to be true, and knew also to be the only honest answer that would not overreach itself. "No, but you might?" The dowager's needle found its way back into the linen. 2 stitches, no more, as though the matter had been settled and did not require further attention from her hands. "His lordship does not read figures as a man ought to read his own accounts. He trusts what he is told, which is a fine quality in a nephew and a poor one in a landlord. Someone in this house ought to occupy her evenings usefully, and you strike me as a woman who does not know how to sit idle even when idleness is what is paid for." She said nothing. She had learned in 3 weeks at Hartswell Grange that the wisest answer to an offer not yet fully made was silence, lest eagerness be mistaken for presumption. "I will speak to Mr. Aldous," the dowager went on, naming the steward as one might name a fixture of the house, the east chimney, the broken pump, a thing long present and long unquestioned. "He will not like it. Men who have kept a room to themselves for 20 years rarely welcome company in it, however harmless the company may seem." "I have no wish to give offense." "No," the dowager agreed, and here, for the first time, something like a dry amusement passed across her face, and was gone again before it could be called a smile. "But you will, all the same. It cannot be helped. Some kinds of offense are given merely by entering a room and asking what is in it." She thought of her father then, of the way he had entered strangers' fields with his chain and his instruments, and been met, more often than not, with exactly that species of resentment The offensive measurement itself, as though to ask what a thing truly was, constituted an accusation before any wrong had been named. "When shall I begin?" she asked. "Tomorrow," said the dowager, and took up two more stitches, "before he has time to tidy anything away." The estate office had not been swept, she thought, so much as abandoned to the appearance of order, an arrangement of surfaces that discouraged inquiry rather than invited it. The steward received her at 8, standing behind his desk in the manner of a man defending a position rather than welcoming a visitor, and told her, with the particular courtesy that conceals refusal as agreement, that she was very welcome to sit, though there was little here that would interest a governess. "I am told to occupy my evenings usefully," she said. The dowager thought the ledgers might serve. "The dowager," he said, "has never had occasion to read one." He gave her the oldest volumes first. She understood this later as a kind of test, or perhaps a courtesy extended in the certainty that it cost him nothing, since surely no woman raised on samplers in French verbs could make sense of columns 30 years old, their ink browned, their pages soft as cloth from handling. She thanked him. She did not tell him that her father had taught her to read a ledger before he had taught her to read a novel, that she had sat at his elbow in a dozen farmhouses while he reconciled a landholder's boundary against a landholder's memory, and had learned, long before she understood why it mattered, that a column of figures is a kind of confession, if one is patient enough to make it speak. She began, that first evening, not with suspicion but with method. His method, her father's method, the only one she trusted. Read once for sense, read again for arithmetic, and mark in the margin, always, whatever refused to agree with itself. She worked by a single candle because the steward had not offered a second, and the cold came up through the floorboards in a way that made her grateful for her father's old wool stockings, darned twice at the heel. It was past 10 when she found the barn roof. The invoice was dated the 14th of March, a repair to storm damage, £4 11s. The steward's own hand steady and unremarkable. She might have passed over it, she nearly did, but something in her father's training would not let a date lie unexamined, and she turned, almost idly, to the estate's weather log, kept faithfully by some previous hand for reasons of husbandry rather than suspicion. The 14th of March had been recorded as fair. So had the week before it and the week after. No rain, no storm. No damage that the sky at least would admit to. She sat with the two books open before her, the candle guttering, and did not move for some time. Then she took out her father's ledger, cracked, familiar, still faintly smelling of the leather satchel it had traveled in, and beside the barn roof entry, in the margin, in pencil, she made her first tally mark. She did not sleep well that night, though she would not have called it wakefulness either. It was more that her mind kept returning to the barn roof the way a tongue returns to a broken tooth, testing the ache to see if it was still there. By morning she told herself it was nothing. A single entry. A steward's memory faulty by a week or two. A date transcribed in haste. A candle burned low on the night the ink was set down. Her father had taught her that an error was not a crime, only an invitation to look twice, and so she resolved to look twice before she allowed herself to think anything further. She found the account book that recorded the payment itself, and there the trouble compounded rather than resolved. £4 11s dispersed to a Slater in Wakefield, a name she did not recognize, though she had by then read enough of the estate's correspondence to know most of the tradesmen it kept. She searched the ledger's earlier pages for any prior dealing with this same Slater. There was none. A man engaged once for a single repair, on a day the sky had been fair, and never engaged again in 20 years of record. She went, that afternoon, to the barn itself. The roof was new, newer, at least, than most of the outbuildings, its slates darker and less lichened than those of the stable beside it, but she could not say from the ground whether it had been laid in March or in some other month altogether, in a year that might not even have been the one the invoice claimed. It was not proof. She understood that. Her father's own voice came to her, patient and dry, the way it always had when she brought him a half-formed conclusion. A measurement is not a fact until it is checked against another measurement. One invoice against one weather log was suspicion. She would need more than suspicion before she said a word to anyone in that house. She returned to the office that evening and began, methodically, to search backward through the years for other repairs claimed against fair weather. Other tradesmen who appeared once and vanished. Other sums that arrived in round, convenient figures rather than the ragged totals of honest labor. It was slow work, and the candle was rationed, and her fingers ached from the cold, long before her eyes tired of the columns. But she found a second entry before midnight, a chimney repair, 11 months later, claimed against a storm the log recorded as a light frost and nothing more, and beside it, in her father's ledger, in the same careful pencil, she made a second tally mark. 2 marks now stood in the margin, side by side, patient and small. The way her father had always said the truth first arrives. Not as thunder, but as a pattern only the attentive would trouble themselves to notice. By the third night she had learned the shape of the office well enough to move through it without a candle for the first few steps. The position of the second desk drawer that stuck unless lifted at the corner, the loose board beneath the window that spoke if trodden on carelessly. She had begun, too, to understand the rhythm of the fraud, if fraud it was, though she still refused herself that word. It came in waves, not a steady drain, but a tide, heavy in years when the estate's harvest had been poor and money scarce enough that a small theft might vanish into general hardship, lighter in years when accounts were more likely to be scrutinized by a landlord not yet buried in grief or debt. Whoever had built this pattern, if it was a pattern, understood arithmetic the way her father had understood soil, not as numbers alone, but as behavior, as the way men act when they believe no one is measuring them twice. She began keeping her own shadow ledger, a plain exercise book bought years before for her own use, ruled faintly by her own hand, into which she copied dates, sums, and the weather log entries beside them, so that no single volume in the house would show her suspicion entire. If anyone opened the estate books, they would find only what had always been there. If anyone opened the ledger her father had left her, they would find tally marks any surveyor's daughter might make from habit. Only in the private exercise book, hidden beneath a stack of the child's copybooks, did the two truths sit side by side, growing quietly less deniable with each entry she added. By the 5th night, 4 irregular repairs had become 7, and the 7 laid end to end across 2 decades, totaled a sum she did not yet dare write down in full, though her mind had already performed the addition and recoiled from it. She noticed, too, a smaller pattern within the larger one. The same 2 tradesmen's names recurring for the costliest repairs. Men whose signatures, when she held pages up to the window's gray daylight, bore a stiffness that did not match the easy, practiced hand of true labor. A signature learned quickly, she thought, is not the same as a signature earned over years of writing it. She said nothing of this to the child during their lessons, nor to the butler when he brought the tea tray, and lingered, as he had taken to doing, a moment longer than duty required. She only asked him once, with the flat curiosity of idle conversation, how long the tradesmen of the district had served the estate, and watched his face carefully as he answered, carefully enough that when he mentioned, almost in passing, that one of the 2 names she had marked had died some 9 years past, she said nothing at all, and wrote it down the moment he left the room. She sat with that fact for a long while after the door had closed, turning it the way her father had once turned a chain link that would not lie, flat, testing it for the fault before deciding whether the fault was in the metal or in her own eye. A dead man's signature, appearing fresh on paper, dated within the last 12 months. She copied the entry into her own ledger beside her father's tally marks, and beneath it she wrote the date twice, once in her ordinary hand and once in the deliberate, upright script she used only when she wished a fact to feel permanent. The candle had burned low enough that she trimmed it before continuing, and in the trimming she thought of her father's habit of pausing at exactly such moments. Not from weariness, he had told her once, but because a tired eye invents corrections that a rested eye would never permit. She rested her eyes now. She did not rest her mind. By the time the household clock in the hall struck the half-hour past 10, she had traced the dead tradesman's name through 4 further entries, each one a repair to guttering or plaster that no living person could confirm had ever been performed, and each one paid at a sum some third again higher than the estate's other invoices for similar work in years she could verify. She noted this in the margin using her father's mark for a discrepancy unresolved. A small cross within a circle, a symbol he had shown her when she was no older than the child she now taught, saying that a good surveyor never pretended a doubt was a certainty, and never let a certainty masquerade as a doubt. The fire in the grate had gone to embers before she allowed herself to stop. She banked it herself rather than ring for the maid, not from any performance of thrift, but because she did not wish another soul in the room while the papers lay open before her, and because some part of her, some part she did not examine too closely, did not wish to be found here at all, bent over another family's ruin with her father's ledger propped open like a second Bible. She locked the estate office as she had found it, the key returned to its hook behind the door where the butler had shown her it was kept, and climbed the back stair to her own small room with her hands still cold from the ink and the draught beneath the office door. She did not sleep at once. She lay listening to the wind working at the casement, and thought of the dead man's hand forging itself onto paper long after the man himself had gone into the ground, and wondered, with a coldness that surprised her, coming as it did from a girl raised to speak gently of the departed, who exactly had been holding the pen. By morning the question had not left her, though she dressed and went down to the schoolroom as though nothing in the house had shifted at all. The child was fractious that day, complaining of the cold in the inkwell, and she found herself grateful for the small tyranny of lessons, the copying of sums, the recitation of rivers, because it gave her hands something to do that was not turning pages in her mind. But at the noon recess, when the girl was sent to the dowager for her hour of French, she did not rest. She went instead to the estate office with a folded paper in her apron pocket, on which she had written, the night before, by candle stub, 3 dates that troubled her most. The first was the barn roof invoice, dated to a dry month. The second was a payment to a mason for repointing the dairy wall, dated 11 days after the estate's own weather log recorded a frost hard enough to have cracked any fresh mortar within a fortnight, work that should have shown a second charge for repair, and did not. The third was smaller, almost nothing, a sum of 4 shillings 9pence paid twice in 1 quarter to a man named only as T. Illard, Carter, in a hand she had come to recognize as the steward's own, though the receipts themselves were meant to be the tenant's marks. She had learned this from her father without ever being taught it directly, that fraud rarely announces itself in the great sums. It hides in the shillings. A man bold enough to steal pounds leaves pound-shaped holes. A man cautious enough to steal for 20 years leaves only small, repeated inconsistencies, each one so slight it could be dismissed as a clerk's error, until they are laid end to end, and the pattern declares itself. She copied the 3 entries into her father's ledger, in the margin, in his own system of tally marks, doubled and cross-checked, and beneath them she wrote nothing. No conclusion, no accusation. She had learned that much from watching him work. The figures were to be allowed to speak for themselves, without her voice added beneath them like a thumb on the scale. She was replacing the estate volumes on their shelf, careful to align the spines exactly as she had found them, when she heard the office door swing wider than the draught alone could account for, and felt, before she turned, that she was no longer the only person in the room. The steward stood in the frame, with his hat still in his hand, as though he had come in from outside rather than crossed the hall, and he looked first at the shelf and then at the ledger under her arm, and said nothing at all, which frightened her more than any word he might have chosen. The silence stretched a full 3 seconds before he moved, and she counted them the way her father had taught her to count the interval between lightning and thunder, as though distance might be measured in the space between a man's stillness and his first word. "Miss," he said at last, and set his hat upon the corner of the desk with a care that struck her as deliberate, a man arranging his composure alongside his belongings. "I did not know the room was in use. The dowager gave me leave of the office in the evenings," she said, "for my own accounts. A governess's wage does not stretch far without discipline." It was not untrue, and she offered it plainly, without haste, because she had learned from 3 weeks in his presence that haste was the one thing that made him look twice at a person. He nodded slowly, as though weighing the sentence for a hidden seam, and his eyes went again to the shelf behind her, to the estate volumes whose spines she had aligned so carefully, and to the space where his own working ledger sat, a half-inch out of true from where she had found it. "You keep the shelves very neat," he said. "I was raised to it." "Raised by a surveyor," he said, "who left you a book and a chain and little else, from what I am told." There was no unkindness in it, only the flat recitation of facts he had gathered somewhere, from the butler, perhaps, or the dowager's idle talk over tea, and she understood that he was testing which of them would blink first at the mention of her poverty. She did not blink. She held her father's ledger a fraction tighter beneath her arm, and said nothing, and it was he who looked away, toward the window, where the last gray light was failing over the home farm. "The nights draw in early this month," he said, which was not an answer to anything, and she recognized it for what it was. A man retreating from a room he had entered too quickly, uncertain why his own office had come to feel occupied by someone else's order. He took up his hat again. At the door he paused, and for a moment she thought he might ask outright what she had been reading, what she had copied, why her hand had been so near the shelf of receipt books. But he only said, "Good night, miss," in the tone of a man closing an account he did not yet know was short, and left her alone with the smell of tallow and old paper and the small, cold certainty that he would remember, tomorrow, exactly where he had found her standing. She waited until the sound of his boots had faded past the gun-room and the outer door had shuttered on its hinges before she allowed herself to breathe fully again. The candle had burned low, its wax pooling unevenly against the brass stick her father had once carried into the fields to mark boundary posts after dark. She set the receipt book back precisely where she had found it, spine aligned to the dust shadow on the shelf, for she had learned long ago that a surveyor's daughter left no line uneven, no mark that could be read as disturbance. But her hands were not steady, and she pressed them flat against the desk until they were. The barn roof invoice was copied now, in her own small hand, into the back pages of her father's ledger, beneath the column where she had begun. 3 weeks prior, in the idle hours the dowager had granted her under pretense of occupying a governess's empty evenings, to set the estate's weather logs beside its repair accounts, the way her father had once set a chain measurement beside a boundary claim to see where the two disagreed. They disagreed here. 6 pounds. 4 shillings. Paid in April of that year for storm damage to the north barn, and no rain recorded in the estate log for the whole of that
month. Only frost and a note in the gamekeeper's script that the ground had been too hard to break for planting. A man did not pay to repair what the sky had not broken. She turned back further, to March, to February, hunting now, not for the shape of an error, but for its rhythm, the way her father had taught her to hunt a fence line that wandered from its true bearing, not by the one crooked post, but by the pattern of crookedness repeating itself, decade after decade, in the same family's hand. She found a second invoice. Then, before the candle guttered, a third, dated 11 years past. for repairs to a mill wheel that the tenant registry showed had been replaced entirely only 4 years before that. Nothing was repaired twice in so short a span unless someone wished it to seem so. She closed the ledger softly, aware of how the house settled around her in small groans and creaks, as if it too were an old set of accounts uneasy under scrutiny. Somewhere above, a door closed. Somewhere below, the kitchen fire was being banked for the night. She thought of the steward's face at the window, the way he had spoken of early nights as though the darkening year were itself an excuse. And she understood, with the same cold clarity her father had once brought to a disputed boundary stone, that she was no longer merely reading his books. She was following them somewhere he did not wish her to go. She did not sleep well that night, though the room the housekeeper had given her was warmer than any she had known since her father's death, and she lay listening to the wind test the window frames as though it too were searching for a weakness to exploit. By morning she had resolved to widen her search beyond the barn and the mill wheel, to the tenant rolls themselves, for if a man would falsify one repair, he would not stop at falsifying only 3. She rose before the rest of the house, dressed by the gray light that came reluctant through the frost-furred glass, and went down to the estate office with her father's chain coiled in her pocket, though she had no need of it there. She carried it, she admitted to herself, the way another woman might carry a locket, for the comfort of the metal's weight against her hip. The office was cold enough that her breath hung before her, and she worked with her shawl drawn tight, cross-referencing the tenant registry against the repair ledger, tallying dates in the margin in her father's mark, a short stroke, a long stroke, a circle for discrepancy, until she found what she had feared she would find. Not 3 false entries, but 9, spread across 11 years, each one small enough to pass a careless eye, each one written in the same steady, unhurried hand that suggested a man entirely unafraid of being read. She sat back from the desk and pressed her cold fingers to her mouth, not from horror. She had schooled herself against horror the day her father died, but from the particular vertigo of understanding a thing too large to have been an accident. 9 entries meant a method. A method meant a decision, made once and repeated, the way a tradesman repeats a stitch until it no longer requires thought. The door opened behind her without warning, and she closed the ledger flat beneath her palm before she had consciously decided to hide it. It was only the butler, carrying a fresh scuttle of coal, who paused when he saw her there in the gray, unlit cold, and did not ask what she was doing, though his eyes went briefly to the ledger under her hand. "You've found something," he said. It was not a question. She considered denying it, the way she had denied everything to the steward at the window. But something in the old man's face, the patience of a servant who had watched too long and said too little, persuaded her otherwise. "I have found a pattern," she said carefully. "I have not yet found where it ends." He set the coal scuttle down by the grate, slow and deliberate, as though giving himself time to choose his next words. "Then you had best find it soon," he said, "before he does." She did not ask him what he meant by it, and he did not offer more, only crossed to the grate and began building up the fire with the unhurried economy of a man who had done the same task 10,000 mornings, and would do it 10,000 more, whatever else changed around him. But his hands, she noticed, were not quite steady. A man who had carried coal for 20 years did not spill it on the hearthstone from nerves alone, and yet he did, twice, and swept it up without remark. "Before he does," she repeated, once the fire had caught. "You believe he suspects me already." "I believe," the butler said, "that a man who has kept a ledger crooked for as long as some men keep a garden knows the sound of another hand turning its pages. He will not need to see you here. He will feel it, the way a man feels weather change in an old wound." She thought of the steward at the window 3 days prior, his voice mild, almost kind, asking after her father's health as though he had not known perfectly well the man was 18 months in his grave. She thought of his hands, folded and patient, and how patience in a guilty man was not the same thing as patience in an innocent one, though from the outside they wore an identical face.
Then I have very little time, she said, more to herself than to him. You have some, the butler allowed. He will not act rashly. Rash men do not keep accounts crooked for 2 decades without being caught. He will wait and watch and decide what is worth doing about you before he does it. He straightened, dusting his palms against his apron, and for a moment something passed over his face that was almost apology. I am only a butler, miss. I have counted his silences longer than I have counted his money. I cannot swear to figures, but I can swear that a man does not flinch at the mention of old repair bills unless there is something buried beneath them. She opened the ledger again, the 9 entries waiting where she had left them, patient as stones. Barn roof, October of 1 year. Stable wall, the March following. A granary door that had, according to the estate's own weather log, never once seen the rain it was repaired against. Small sums. Sums small enough to escape a careless eye, and repeated often enough to escape a tired one. I will need the rent books next, she said. Not the fair copies. The originals, if any remain. The butler considered this, then nodded slowly as though passing a verdict on himself as much as on her. There is a chest in the old muniment room, he said. No one has opened it since before I came into this house. He paused at the door, coal scuttle empty now, his silhouette dark against the gray morning beyond. I will bring you the key tonight, he said, when the house is asleep. The house did sleep eventually, though it took its time about it, a door somewhere closing twice, as if the first attempt had not satisfied whoever held it, and then the long settling creak of old timber giving up its heat to the night. She sat by the window with her father's ledger open on her knee and did not light a second candle, for candles were counted in this house as carefully as everything else, and she had learned already which economies were watched and which were not. The butler came a little after 11, his own candle cupped against the draught, and behind him the key, old, black, longer than her hand, turned in a lock that answered with the reluctance of something that had not expected to be asked again. The muniment room smelled of tallow long gone cold and of paper that had not been disturbed in a generation. Chests along the wall, iron-bound, their leather straps gone stiff and pale. He led her to the third from the door without needing to search for it, which told her something of its history that she did not ask him to confirm. My father spoke of it once, he said, low, as if the room itself might repeat him. Said the old steward's father kept his own accounts here, separate from the house books. I did not think to wonder why a man would keep 2 sets of anything. She knelt before it. The lid resisted, then gave with a sound like a held breath released. Inside, bundled with string gone brittle as dead grass, lay ledgers far older than the ones she had already searched, their covers marked not with the current steward's careful copperplate, but with a rougher hand, decades faded, the ink brown as the season itself. She lifted the topmost bundle into the candlelight and untied it with the same patience her father had taught her for chain and peg, for a line that must be measured twice before it could be trusted once. The first page was dated 1804. She felt something settle in her, cold and certain, the particular quiet that came not from surprise but from confirmation, the sensation of a suspicion.
Finding, at last, its floor. 22 years he has held the post, the butler said behind her, and his father held it 18 before that. And here, she said, turning a page, is where his father began. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Somewhere above them the house continued its ordinary sleep, unaware that beneath its floors a book had just opened that would not easily close again. She set the ledger on her knee, drew out her own, and began, carefully in the margin, in tally marks her father had taught her before she could properly write. The first line of a reckoning that would not end with this chest, nor with this night. The work went on by the arithmetic of candle stubs rather than clock hands. One burned to its collar before she had cleared 1809. A second lit and burning low before she reached the year her own father had first taken up his chain. In a different county entirely, unaware that his methods would one day be needed here, in a house he never saw, against a man he never met. The pattern held with a consistency that would have been, in other circumstances, almost admirable. Every third year a repair invoice swelled beyond its neighbors. Every such swelling matched no entry in the tenant complaint book, no line in the weather log, no mention in the letters the old lord had exchanged with his rector about storm damage or drought. The money simply left the ledger and did not arrive anywhere she could see. Not yet. That, she understood, was merely the first half of the chain. A thing missing was not proof. A thing missing and found elsewhere was proof. She was still turning pages near 2 a.m. when the butler, standing sentinel by the door with the stillness of a man twice her age and long practiced in patience, said quietly, "He came down an hour past, stood at the office door, did not come in." She did not look up. Did he see the candlelight? He would have to be blind not to. She finished the line she was marking, a tally against a tally, her father's small double check. The habit that had saved surveys from lawsuits and would, she suspected, save something larger than a survey now, before she allowed herself to consider what that meant. A steward of 22 years' standing did not mistake a governess's candle in the estate office for an idle evening's reading. He would know, by instinct if not by certainty, what kind of book required tally marks copied so carefully into a second hand. "Then he knows," she said. "He has likely known since the dowager first sent you in with the household accounts a fortnight past. A man does not spend 3 generations minding a ledger without learning to smell when someone else is minding it too." She closed the topmost chest bundle and retied its string with the same care she had used to loosen it, so that nothing would appear disturbed to an eye less patient than her own. "Then we have less time than I supposed." "You have less time," the butler corrected gently, "than a woman doing sums for her own satisfaction. You have exactly as much time as a man with something to lose decides to give you, and men with something to lose are rarely generous with the clock." She thought of the Lord, asleep or not asleep 2 floors above, still believing his debts a matter of poor harvests and bad seasons rather than a family's quiet inheritance of theft. She thought of the steward standing at a dark doorway, watching a candle he could not extinguish without revealing that he wished to. And she thought, not for the first time, that discovery was a door that opened only one way, and that she had already stepped through it. The morning brought frost thick enough to whiten the inside of the estate office window, and she worked with her gloves cut at the fingertips, so the pen would still answer to her hand. The fire had not been laid before 7. She had asked that it not be, for a room too warm invited a servant to linger tending it, and she wanted no witnesses to which pages she chose. She began where the butler's warning had left her, not with the barn roof invoice, which she had already copied twice into her father's ledger in his own tally-mark hand, but with the wage book. 3 generations of stewards had drawn a salary of £40 a year, a sum unremarkable on its face. But she set the wage entries beside the rent rolls for the same years, the way her father had once set a chain measurement beside a neighbor's claimed boundary, and she found the seam. In 1809, in a year when the rent rolls showed 6 tenant farms paying in full, the steward's father had recorded a supplement for extraordinary duties of £11, unexplained, uncountersigned by any lord living or dead who might have authorized it. The same phrase recurred in 1813, again in 1817, always in years when the harvest had been thin enough that no one above stairs thought to question a shortfall, and always in some small enough to vanish into the general poverty of a bad season. She copied the phrase 3 times into her own book, underlining it once, then again, the way her father had underlined a discrepancy he intended to return to. Her hand did not shake, though the room was cold enough that her breath rose visibly over the page, and she watched it fog and clear, with a strange detached attention, as though the fact of her own living breath were itself a piece of evidence to be recorded and dismissed. A floorboard spoke somewhere above her, Not urgent, only old, the house settling into another degree of cold, and she lifted her head and listened the way she had learned to listen since the fortnight began. For a step, for a hesitation, for the particular silence of someone standing still on purpose. Nothing followed. She returned to the page. She did not yet have the Leeds Bank, did not yet have a name behind the false one she suspected waited there, patient as a stone under water. But she had £11 in 1809, and £11 in 1813, and £11 in 1817, and a phrase repeated by 3 different hands across 3 different decades as though inherited along with the ledger itself. She closed the book, blew twice on her ink-stained fingers, and understood, with the same plain certainty her father had once brought to a disputed field line, that a pattern repeated is no longer an accident. It is a signature. She carried the discovery to the butler 2 mornings later, not because propriety required it, but because she had learned in 6 weeks at Hartswell Grange that the butler's silence held more intelligence than most men's speech. She found him in the pantry, counting silver against a list in a hand she recognized now as careful but untrained in figures, the same hand that had, months before, confessed to her over cold tea that something in the steward's books had never sat right with him, though he could not say what. She set the ledger open before him and pointed, not to the numbers, but to the phrase. "Read that," she said, "and that, and that." He read it 3 times, moving his lips slightly, the way men do when they have learned letters but not the shorthand of accounts. Then he looked up, and something in his face closed like a door drawn quietly shut against a draught. "My father used those very words," he said. "When I was a boy, I heard him say them to the old steward's father in this very kitchen." "What words?" "Owed and not forgotten. I thought it a kindness once. A steward's family looking after its own." He set down the silver. "I did not think it a ledger entry." She asked him then whether he had kin in Leeds. Someone who might know a bank, might know a name behind a name. He was quiet long enough that she thought he would refuse her, and she understood that refusal, for a servant's discretion, was the only currency he owned in a house not his own. But he told her, at last, of a cousin, a clerk, at a bank on Boar Lane, a sober man who owed him a debt of gratitude older than either of their memories, for a kindness done during a hard winter neither of them spoke of any more. "I cannot write to him," the butler said. "It would want a letter above my station, and questions I do not know how to ask." "I know how to ask them," she said. He studied her, not with suspicion now, but with the particular respect men reserve for those who have proven, quietly and without asking permission, that they are equal to a task. He drew a scrap of paper from his apron and wrote the cousin's name and direction in his slow, careful hand, and slid it across the pantry table as though it were something that might still be taken back. "Mind you," he said, "if the steward learns of this before it is finished—" "He will not learn of it from me." "No," the butler agreed, looking at her steadily. "I did not suppose he would." She folded the paper into her father's ledger, between the pages, that held £11 3 times over, and felt, for the first time since the fever took him, that she was not merely remembering her father's method, but continuing his work, carried forward, unfinished, into a house that did not yet know it was being measured. She wrote the letter that night, by a single candle burned down to its collar, in a hand deliberately plainer than her own, the hand of a governess inquiring after a distant relation's employment, nothing more. She did not name the steward. She did not name the estate. She asked only after an account opened in 1804 under a name she had found twice in the margins of the oldest ledger, half erased as though someone long dead had thought better of writing it clearly even then. E. Marsh, and beneath it, in a different ink, for services rendered. She sealed the letter with wax from the schoolroom desk, the child's wax, sea green and smelling faintly of nutmeg,
because it was what lay to hand, and she did not want the household's crest anywhere near it. The reply came 11 days later, in weather that had turned the roads to iron, carried up from the village by a boy who did not know what he carried and would not have cared if he had. She took it into the cold library before the fire was lit because she wanted to be alone with it, and because the room had become, in these weeks, more truly hers than the schoolroom ever had. The bank clerk wrote, in the tight, apologetic hand of a man unused to correspondence outside his ledgers. An account under the name E. Marsh had indeed been opened at the Leeds house in the spring of 1804, he wrote, and had received deposits at irregular intervals since, never large, never small enough to draw notice, a pattern he described, without knowing he described a crime, as steady as rent. The account remained open. The most recent deposit had been made in September, not 3 months past. She read the sentence twice. September. The estate's own books, in the steward's careful hand, recorded no such sum, leaving any account she had traced, which meant either a source she had not yet found, or a second book she had not yet been shown. She sat with that for a long moment, the fire unlit, her breath faint in the air, and understood that she had reached the edge of what could be proven from paper alone. Somewhere in this house, in a drawer, a false-backed ledger, a strong-box kept from even the butler's eye, there was a document that would close the distance between suspicion and certainty. She did not yet know where. She knew only that the steward, 22 years keeping these books, and his father 22 before him, had not survived that long by leaving such things where a governess might stumble upon them by chance. She would have to be given reason to look where she had no reason to be. And for that, she understood, she would need to ask something of the one person in the house whose authority no one, not even a steward 3 generations deep in trust, could refuse. She found him in the estate office the following morning. Though she had rehearsed the request 3 times over breakfast and discarded each version as either too bold or too meek. He was standing at the window with a letter from his solicitor in one hand, his face arranged in the particular stillness he wore when a thing troubled him more than he would say. "I require access to the muniment room," she said, before she could soften it. He turned. "For what purpose?" "There is a sum unaccounted for, £200, perhaps more, that does not appear in any ledger I have seen. If it exists on paper at all, it will be old paper. Deeds, leases, correspondence going back further than the account books themselves. That room has not been opened in my memory. My father kept it locked and gave the key to no one but the steward." The word sat between them like a struck match. She watched him understand it as he said it, the small cold recognition passing over his features that the very man she suspected was also the man entrusted with the room most likely to hide the proof of it. "Then I must ask you to have it opened without him," she said. He did not answer at once. He set the letter down on the desk with a precision that suggested he was buying himself a moment's thought, and when he spoke again his voice had lost its edge of command and taken on something more careful. "You understand what you are asking. If I order that room broken open on the word of a governess, and nothing is found, I will have insulted a man who has served this family for 2 decades on nothing more than your instinct. I understand it. And if something is found," she met his eyes, "then you will have to decide what 22 years of trust is worth against what it has cost you." He studied her a long moment, not with the cold assessment of their first meeting in the hall, the wet cloak, the dismissive glance, but with something that had, without either of them marking the exact hour of its arrival, become attention, real attention, of the kind he had given to very little since his wife's death. "The locksmith comes from Leeds on Thursdays," he said finally. "I will send for him tomorrow. You will be present when the room is opened, and no one else, not the steward, not my aunt, not the servants, will be told beforehand. Thank you." "Do not thank me yet." He turned back to the window and the letter and whatever burden it carried that he had not shared with her. "You have not yet told me what you expect to find in there." "No," she agreed, "I have not." Thursday arrived with a hard frost that silvered the gravel drive and rimmed the stable-yard trough with ice thick enough to bear a boot heel. The locksmith came up from Leeds on the noon coach, a compact man with cold-cracked knuckles and a leather roll of picks that he handled the way her father had once handled his measuring chain, with the unhurried respect of a man who trusted his tools more than his luck. The room in question was not, properly speaking, a room at all, but a closet built into the thickness of the old estate office wall, sealed behind a door so plainly painted to match the paneling that she had walked past it 11 times, before she thought to measure the wall's interior distance against its exterior and found 4 missing feet unaccounted for. The Lord stood with his arms folded, saying nothing, while the locksmith worked the mechanism with a slim iron pick and a patience that made the minutes stretch. She counted her own pulse to steady it. Frost had gathered on the inside of the office window overnight, and she watched it begin, faintly, to weep in the warmth of the fire someone had lit an hour before. The lock gave with a sound no louder than a dropped coin. Inside, a shelf, a strong box with no lock of its own, and a stack of receipt books bound in the same red boards as the ones burned in the fire 3 weeks past, except these were older, going back further than any she had yet examined, their pages brittle at the corners from disuse rather than handling. She lifted the topmost book with the same care her father had taught her for wet field notes, and opened it under the window light. The entries began in 1804. Not in the steward's current hand, but in a rounder, younger script. His father's, she guessed, before age had cramped it. The tally marks in the margin were not her father's system, but they were a system, consistent, deliberate, and entirely absent from the book she had already reconciled. "There," she said, quieter than she meant to. The Lord crossed to her side. He did not ask what she had found. He simply looked where her finger rested, at a column of figures beside the name of a Leeds bank, and beneath it, in the same careful hand, a name that was not the steward's, nor his father's, nor any name belonging to Hartswell Grange at all. "Whose is this?" he asked. "I don't know yet." She closed the book gently, the way one closes a door on a sleeping child. "But it is the same bank as the letter your aunt found, and it goes back 22 years before that." Outside, the frost on the glass had begun to run in thin silver lines, and somewhere below in the yard, a horse, stamped once against the cold. The Lord said nothing further, but he did not look away from the book in her hands, and for the first time since she had come to Hartswell Grange, she saw something in his face that was not doubt. She spent the next 2 days doing what her father had taught her before she was old enough to understand why it mattered. She made the ledger tell the truth twice. The first telling was simple arithmetic, the kind any clerk could manage, sums added, columns checked, receipts matched to dates. The second telling was slower, and it was hers alone. She traced the false name through every book she could find, back to 1804. The year the current steward had been a boy of 12, too young to hold a pen steady enough for fraud. The hand that had written the false name was not his. It was rounder, older, the letters formed with the particular flourish of a man proud of his penmanship. She had seen that flourish before, in a rent receipt signed 20 years earlier by the steward's father. She did not tell the Lord this immediately. She wanted the numbers whole before she gave him the shape of them. By the third evening the pattern had a spine. Small sums at first, £3 here, 5 there, always attached to repairs that left no mark on the estate's own weather logs or tenant complaints. Then, as the years advanced, the sums grew bolder, as a thief grows bolder when no one asks him to stop. She wrote each discrepancy in her father's tally marks along the margin of her own ledger, 4 strokes and a 5th crossing through, until the columns filled like a fence being built plank by plank around a field no one else could see. The butler brought her tea one night without being asked, and stood a moment longer than necessary at the office door. "You've the look of a man closing in on a fox," he said. "I've the look of a woman who hasn't slept," she answered, but she did not deny the rest of it. He did not smile, but something in his stillness suggested he understood the difference between the two conditions was, at that hour, very small. On the 4th day she found the account itself, not merely a name, but a bank, a branch, a series of deposits spanning decades, growing in the years the steward's father had held the post, and continuing, unbroken, into the years the son had held it after him. The dates did not lie. The hand changed twice across the pages, father to son, the same account swelling under 2 different pens. She sat back from the desk and looked at the fire, which had burned low without her noticing. £2,000. Perhaps more. She would need the Leeds correspondence to be certain, and for that she would need the butler's cousin again, and more nights like this one. Cold, silent, exact. She closed the ledger and did not open it again that night, though she did not sleep either. She simply sat, listening to the house settle around her, thinking of the 2 hands in the same book, father and son, and what it meant that neither of them had ever once considered they might be caught. The bank correspondence arrived on a Tuesday, folded twice and sealed with the plain wax of a clerk who understood discretion better than most men understood loyalty. She read it standing, still in her cloak, snow melting from the hem onto the office floor. The account held a name, not the steward's own, but close enough to be recognized by anyone who had ever signed a receipt beside him. Thomas Hale. His grandfather's name, in fact, borrowed forward like a coat handed down through the family along with the ledgers. She sat and did the sum a final time, though she had done it a dozen times already and knew the answer would not change. £2,140. She wrote it once more in her father's tally hand, checked it against itself, and did not permit herself the satisfaction of underlining it. The Lord came to the office an hour later without knocking, which had become, by that winter, its own kind of courtesy between them. She turned the papers so he could read them without leaning across the desk. He read for a long time. Longer, she thought, than the figures required. 3 generations, he said at last. Yes. And he knew you were coming for him. Since the fire in the receipt books, perhaps before. He did not sit. He stood with one hand on the back of the chair, looking at the final page as though it were a door he had not yet decided whether to open. What is owed to the law, he said, and what is owed to the name are not always the same debt. She said nothing. It was not her place to answer a question he had not fully asked, and she had learned, across 4 months in that house, the particular discipline of silence that let a man arrive at his own conclusions without the indignity of being led there. "If this goes before a magistrate," he went on, "it goes into the newspapers in Leeds and then in York, and every tenant on this land learns his rents were skimmed for 20 years by the very family that collected them. Yes, and I will have saved the money and lost the name. She
closed the ledger, gently, the way her father had taught her to close a book that had told the truth and did not need to be made to shout it. "That is not a sum I can reconcile for you," she said. "Only the figures." He looked at her then, not at the papers, at her, for longer than was strictly necessary, and she understood that whatever he decided in the coming days would not be a decision she was permitted to make for him, only one she would be asked quietly to stand beside once it was made. He folded the letter into his coat and left without another word, and she sat a long while after, listening to his footsteps recede down the cold corridor, wondering what kind of mercy a man learns to grant when the money is finally, at last, his own to forgive. The steward left Hartswell Grange on the 2nd Tuesday of January in a hired cart loaded with 3 trunks and no farewells. having signed a paper agreeing to repay £400 from the sale of a small property near Wakefield that had been, it turned out, purchased with the estate's own diverted rents. It was not the £2,140 in full. It was not justice as a magistrate would have weighed it. But the name held, and the tenants who came that spring to pay their rents did so, without knowing why the new steward, a quiet man from Ripon with clean handwriting and no family history on the estate, counted every shilling twice in front of them. She did not attend the steward's departure. She was in the schoolroom that morning correcting a column of sums with the child, when she heard the cart on the gravel below, and she did not go to the window. The reconciliation was finished by the 3rd week of January, every figure traced, every false receipt matched against its true weather, its true invoice, its true year, and she presented the completed ledger to him in the library on a Thursday evening when the frost had made lace of the window panes. He read it from the first page to the last without speaking, and when he closed it he did not thank her in the manner of a man thanking a servant. He asked her, instead, what wage she required to continue the work as her own. The household gathered in the hall the following week to hear it announced, the dowager in her black bombazine, the butler standing where he had always stood, the child holding her governess's hand, though she was no longer, strictly, a governess at all. He did not raise his voice. He never had, in all the months she had known him. "She has always owned these accounts," he said. "I have only now signed the paper that says so." She did not smile. She had learned since October that a smile was a currency she need not spend on every occasion, and this was not an occasion for spending it. But she did not look away from him either, and in the small silence that followed, the butler's mouth moved in something that was almost, and only almost, a smile of his own. That night she sat alone in the estate office with her father's ledger open beside the new one bearing her name, and she wrote the date in the margin the way he had taught her, a clean stroke, no flourish, and breathed a small cloud of fog onto the cold glass beside her candle before she blew it out. She was not, by any measure that mattered to her now,